All right, today's topic is, in broad terms, responsive web design. And in maybe more specific terms, we're going to cover Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework that contains CSS and JavaScript that allows you to do some things pretty quickly and in a responsive way. So I want to make sure everyone understands responsive design first. So I have a little bit of a review about that. We will do our best to cover all these topics today. If we do not, again, please take the time to read through those on your own time. Responsive web design, great article about it. 3 fundamentals. Media queries. We'll see an example of that. That's where you define a style sheet that only applies under certain circumstances. Therefore, you can, based on something like typically the width of the screen, you can style it a different way if it's a wide width versus a narrow width. Fluid grids. We'll see examples of those. Instead of using absolute values such as pixels, using relative proportions. And that's true of almost everything. You wouldn't define an area as being 600 pixels wide, for example. It's much better to define it as 60% or something along those lines. And finally, flexible images. And that's the same thing here, same idea here. So let's look over an example. I believe this is the example I went over in the intro to web development. Here's some examples of media queries. This example, notice that as the width of the page changes, elements on the page change. And when it hits a certain point, it switches to a totally different layout. Let's look at the page and let's look at the CSS that achieves that. We actually have 2 CSS files, and you can apply more than one CSS file to a web page. And when you do that, the last one wins if there's 2 things that the things have in common. So look at this. If you look at this, we have 2 CSS files. One is defined as main, and the one is defined as desktop. And there's a media query associated with desktop. So what this is saying is every single instance will get this style sheet because there is no media query to it. But only those that meet this criteria, in other words, a computer screen that's at least 800 pixels wide, will get this style sheet. And in this style sheet, the main is the basic one for mobile, typically. where we have a simple background of a yellow color. The width of things are 90%, as you can see. In other words, we're going to stretch this out. We're going to stretch out everything so it forms one column across that. And that's pretty typical in mobile development, to have one column web pages. The image, we say, is 100% of the section that it's in. So notice that it fills up the entire section. We can also hide some content by saying we have a class called desktop only, and the stuff that is tagged as desktop only, if this style sheet is the only one that applies, won't appear. So notice we have these two things that say here's another section, here's another section. They disappear when we go to the mobile design. In general, and it's pretty easy to see why, a mobile design is going to be simpler than the design for a desktop or for a laptop. One column, maybe get rid of some stuff even. Now, the second style sheet overrules some of the things in the first style sheet, but only under these circumstances. If it's a screen, that is, if it's a computer screen, and the minimum width is 800 pixels, at least 800 pixels. And in that case, for example, the body has a different background. The basic background for mobile was simply a yellow background. Here, we're going to have a background that is the image. And we do this for everything. We use a grid view layout for this. And we create a grid for these headers and sections and nav and footer and so on. So in the mobile example, we have a simple single column. In this, we have a grid that contains 3 columns of stuff. Now, one thing you can do, because sometimes if you make something very narrow, stuff overlaps with other stuff. The one thing that you can do is you can make a minimum and maximum width of things. For example, this image. Notice that in this, well, in both of them, this comes from the main style sheet. The image is 100% width of the section. And the maximum width of this is auto. So it's automatically set. And what that means is it won't get any bigger than the actual size of the image. So if the image was 400 by 300, even if you make that bigger than 400 width, the image won't get any bigger than that, which is good because you don't want any distortion or pixelation of the image. Likewise, I can put in a minimum width of a certain width if I don't want these columns getting any smaller. Now, you can actually come up with a very responsive web design using only one style sheet and without using media queries, but it would be very simple. All right. If you have any kind of multi-column thing or anything more involved, you probably would want to use a second style sheet. In this example, we have the same thing. The difference is that we only have one style sheet. I know there's 2 style sheets in the folder, That's only because I forgot to delete it when I copied it over. We can get rid of desktop. Now, the difference between these two is this has one style sheet that has a media query inside of it. So the style sheet actually kind of has two sections. This is a section that always applies. This is a section that applies if this criteria is met. So it's your choice how you do that. You can either have two style sheets and put the media query on the style sheet, or have one style sheet and put the media query on the elements of the style sheet. But basically, this accomplishes exactly the same thing, because all of this stuff through here is included as part of a media query. So everyone will get this, only desktop or computers with a width of 800 or bigger gets these rules. All right, that should be reviewed for you. Let's go on to our next topic, which I believe is Bootstrap. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, this is one cool thing is you can actually do mobile emulation in Chrome, if those of you are not aware of that. So I can bring up that page. And look at what it would be viewed in an emulator. If I go to More Tools, Developer Tools, I can click on this one, and I can see that this would be a mobile device with a width of 400 and a size of a height of 837. Or I can pick, like, that's the iPhone view, iPhone SE, iPhone 14. And so you can emulate that. That way, if you don't have a bunch of actual devices, you can still do some testing on it to make sure that your media queries work the way that you expect them to. All right. Next thing we have is Bootstrap. And there's a few sources for this. There's a Bootstrap tutorial. That's a video. Starts with a mighty explosion. And other stuff about Bootstrap. We're going to look at some specific elements in this. For example, if we want to do a navigation bar. Navigation bar is something that is common to, just about every website would have a navigation bar in it. And navigation, see how I did it in this example. Oftentimes, navigation is oriented horizontally. In this particular one, it's oriented vertically. And when you go to a mobile view, it gets oriented vertically. So here's a basic nav bar. The way that you put Bootstrap in, and we'll see it when we review the source code here, is you either make a copy of some CSS and JavaScript files, or you actually link to them out on a provider. And what you do then is assign classes to each of the things. So for example, this is a fluid container. This is a nav bar. This is a nav bar item. This is a nav bar link. So if you give these classes, you get the behavior. And here's an example of the behavior that when we are certain width of the screen, certain size of the screen, is oriented horizontally. But if we make it narrow, at a certain point, it flips to vertical, which again is exactly what we want to do with our designs as we move towards a smaller, more mobile version of them. All right, we want it to be simpler. We want it to be one column. All right, horizontal columns, horizontal scrolling is not a good thing. All right, vertical scrolling on a mobile device, is a way of life, but horizontal scrolling you want to avoid. So oftentimes what you will do is you will put in and make the mobile thing like this. And notice I don't have any code for this. All I have done is I've included two things. I've included a style sheet, and I've included a JavaScript script. Now, we can actually look at these scripts if we want by pasting them in the address bar of our browser. And yeah, that's very readable. It's like that because it's the minimized version. If you think about it, websites, or how do I want to put this? Developers develop their code using white space in a way to increase the readability because they're going to have to go back and make changes to it at some point. Well, machines don't have to worry about that. Machines aren't concerned about readability. All right, as long as you follow the correct syntax, the machine's going to figure it out just fine. And by eliminating white space, you actually make a fairly big savings of bandwidth and files size that need to be transferred. So a lot of times for any of these libraries like this, you have a minimized version. We can actually see the full version if we do this and just get rid of the min. I got rid of a little bit too much. There we go. This is still going to be very hard to read, but you can get an idea of what it does. All right. Here is a resource that shows you all the classes available. All right, because that's effectively how we invoke the behavior that we want out of Bootstrap. Bootstrap is sort of a standardized way of styling your web page in a way that is responsive. Those of you that are taking CISS232, those pages are done with Bootstrap. If you go and minimize one of those, you'll get a single column navigation. Here's a list of all the Bootstrap classes. And there's a bunch of them. We want to make a radio button. We have how we can style that. We want to make a accordion header that expands and contracts. This shows us the code to do it. How do we do it? Again, simply by assigning classes to it. So to get the accordion to work, you have a section of your page with a class of accordion. You have a set of accordion items. You have the accordion header. And you have the accordion section that expands and collapses and decollapses. So that's how we're going to get all this behavior, simply by assigning classes, these standard classes that are built into Bootstrap, assigning them to our HTML elements. Now, sometimes we want to override some of the defaults for Bootstrap. And this sort of shows you how to do that. They don't recommend that you edit Bootstrap CSS. The reason for that is if Bootstrap comes out with a new version and you have edited that file, you'll have to go and make your edits again to the new version of the file. It would be better for you instead to create a second CSS. And this talks about ways of overriding the CSS. And by creating a custom style sheet, almost in a similar way that we did with the mobile site, where we have a mobile version and a desktop version. Whereas here we have a standard Bootstrap version, and then we have an overridden Bootstrap version CSS file. If you follow through this example, it will show you how you can do that. Let's look at some other examples of stuff in Bootstrap. Bootstrap Grid. Bootstrap Grid by default has 12 columns. You probably would never ever need up over 12 columns on a page. And you can define how big each column is by putting a span to it. So let's look at this example. The first one. Div with a class of columns, small 6 and 6. That means that it takes up, the first column takes up 6 of the 12 spots. The second column takes up the last 6 of the 12 spots. In this one, we've divided it into thirds. So we have a third, a third, or in other words, 4 of the spots. Out of the 12, another 4, another 4. Curious if making that large would do anything to it. Here, if we omit those, if we make these all columns and don't specify how many they are, then Bootstrap does the division for you. But the nice thing is we could do allocate these different ways if we wanted to. So for example, we could make this only 2 of the 12, and then we could make this 6 of the 12. And there's 2 of the 12, there's 4 of the 12, and there's 6 of the 12. So simply by having this structure, you designate a div with a class of row. Inside that, you can have subdivs that have a class of column small, and you can give either the size that you want them to be out of the 12 spaces that are available, or you can just say small. Now, they're using divs here. in HTML5, there are tags other than divs, sections and articles and navs and so on. You can use those as well. It doesn't have to be a div in order to work. So for example, let's make this our nav. So what I'm trying to demonstrate is that it doesn't have to be a div. You can use any of the other structural tags in HTML5, like nav and so on. This is not allowing me to copy paste. Well, we'll just have a small menu then. I don't feel like typing it again. All right. Now the problem with that is that we have a blue on blue. So how would we address that? We would give this a class of text white. Now we can see the link. So don't be deceived by the fact that these examples and some of the other examples you have will contain all divs. We could make that a div. We can make this a header if we wanted to. And we can make this an article. And it still works. Just like it did before. So that's a grid. Here are ways that you can do Bootstrap 5 works on different screen sizes. And there's more examples. This one's pretty basic, as we imagine we're going to get that. This one, on extra small devices, it's going to stack like that. So it demonstrates a 50-50 split on small, medium, large, and extra large large devices. On smaller devices, it will stack. How do we get that? Well, because we've defined the columns for small as 6. So as 6 columns for this, 6 columns for this, 6 of the 12, 6 of the 12. So below small screen, and those screen sizes were defined either this screen or the previous screen. Yeah, the previous screen. So if it's less than 576 pixels, then column small applies or doesn't apply, and it simply just is stacked on top of each other. There's a lot of grids listed in here because this is important. You can see a lot of examples of grids. Here we have an extra small grid for all devices. It's never stacks. Why? Because we defined it as just being a column, not a column small or column large. Likewise, we could go in and make something column large. What that means is on large and larger, we'll have the 2 column, 6 of the 12 and 6 of the 12. So as we make this bigger, it still applies. If we make it smaller though, in this case, when we hit the medium threshold, it will make it stacked single column. So this is actually a very powerful tool. Go over more of these examples and see some more of the things that you can do with it. Jumbotron. Oh, good, it is. I thought for a second it was deprecated in Bootstrap 5, but it isn't. A Jumbotron gives you a nice big header. So you can use this, and you would probably use it not on your div section, but on your header section, if you're really following HTML5 closely. Works exactly the same. All right, those are some examples, and you can see more examples on the W3 School site. Let's look at this example. What I came up with, putting it all together and forming a site. All right. We have a navigation, a Jumbotron, and a grid. Make it white to make it more readable. Here we have our Jumbotron, so the big header on top. Here we have our navigation, which at a larger screen size is going to be stacked horizontally. As we make it smaller, they become stacked vertically. as does the grid. The grid is set up with 3 columns, small. That means that at widths small and above, it'll be stacked horizontally. But once we get into the extra small territory, it is stacked vertically. Now this points to something that I don't know if I ever mentioned before in the web development class, but it is valid. Notice that you can have more than one class in an element. It means these 2 things apply to it, these 2 style rules. For that reason, don't include spaces in your class. You shouldn't include spaces in your class or your IDs. All right, because although something can only have one ID, it's difficult to spell. I don't think you could define a style rule if there was a space in the ID name. Now, what do you need to do for your assignment? You're going to be redoing Lab 1 as a responsive app using Bootstrap. You're going to use the Jumbotron for a header. Two-column section for each of the 3 topics, JavaScript, PHP, and Ajax. A nav section that contains links to the 3 sections within the page, and then a footer. Test the page to make sure it works in a mobile emulator. So this might be a little confusing, so let me draw it for you. Here's your page. You have the Jumbotron. Right? You're going to have for each thing a 2-column section. So you're going to have JavaScript. Two-column section. One of the section contains the links. The other contains information. So you can do it either way. Info in one, links in the other. Then PHP. Info. Links. Ajax. Info and links. Then you'll have a nav, which I should have drawn first, that will have links to these things. JavaScript, PHP, Ajax, that will take you, that are page links, that will take you to the section of the page that's relevant when you click on them. So that in a nutshell is what your stuff will be looking like. And I want you to use Bootstrap in that. It's important to test what you have in a mobile emulator. So for example, this, let's go and view it in a mobile emulator. And this is on the iPhone 14. And as you look, pretty good. All right, are there any questions about any of this? All right, if there are no questions, that's all I had for today. We'll either see you next week or we will see you in lab.